The world is used to thinking of Africa as a warehouse full of raw materials, cheap and endless, always waiting to be shipped abroad. But what happens when that warehouse closes its doors and demands to be treated like a true power in the global economy? Is the West more reliant on Africa than it dares to admit? That question is no longer academic. It's now unfolding in real time. Across the continent, from the gold mines of Ghana to the coffee fields of Uganda, from Niger's uranium to Namibia's lithium, African nations are rewriting the rules. 10 countries, yes, 10 have decided they will no longer export their wealth in its raw, unprocessed form. Instead, they are keeping more of that value at home, refining their own resources, building their own industries, and strengthening their own economies. For the first time in modern history, Africa isn't scrambling to keep up with the world. The world is scrambling to keep up with Africa. This shift is more than economics. It is sovereignty. For decades, Western industries, whether it was jewelry, chocolate, or electric cars, relied on Africa's cheap exports profiting, while African workers stayed poor. But that cycle is ending. The age of Africa as a passive supplier is over, and a new age of dignity, leverage, and independence is beginning. So here's the real question for you. When the balance of power flips this dramatically, who adapts and who collapses? Will Western nations come to Africa as equals, or will they cling to an outdated system of exploitation? And more importantly, will leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso succeed in guiding this transformation, or will others try to stop him? Please share if you feel you are among the first to recognize and support this historic awakening. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than the headlines. Because what we're witnessing right now isn't just about Africa, it's about the future of the world economy. Picture the headlines. 10 African nations, one after another, announcing restrictions or outright bans on exporting their most valuable raw materials. For decades, such a move was unthinkable. Africa was expected to provide oil, gold, coffee, cocoa, uranium, timber, copper, cobalt, lithium, chrome, all flowing cheaply out of the continent to fuel Western factories and keep consumer prices low. That system worked well for the West. But for Africa, it meant endless poverty in lands of immense wealth. That imbalance is now being corrected. Let's start with Ghana, one of the world's leading gold producers. For years, Ghana dug the gold while others reaped the rewards. Multinational companies exported raw ore, refined it abroad, and pocketed the real profits. In 2023, Ghana changed the rules. Mining companies are now required to sell 20% of all refined gold directly to the nation's central bank. This bold move doesn't just secure reserves, it also reduces dependence on the U.S. dollar and the euro. More importantly, companies must refine a portion of the gold inside Ghana. That means new factories, local jobs, and value staying right where the resource comes from. Move east to Uganda, where coffee is king. For generations, Ugandan farmers grew the beans that filled Western cups, but the big profits always went overseas, where the beans were roasted, packaged, and sold at a premium. In 2021, Uganda declared no more. The government banned the export of raw coffee and tea, forcing companies to invest in local processing. Now, Uganda exports roasted and packaged coffee ready for supermarket shelves. The result: more jobs for Ugandans, better wages for farmers, and a stronger sense of ownership over their national wealth. The message is clear: Ugandan coffee isn't just grown in Africa, it's crafted there too. Travel south to Gabon and Mozambique, where timber once flowed cheaply out of the forests. Logs were cut in Africa, but turned into luxury furniture in Europe or Asia. In 2010, Gabon slammed the brakes, banning raw log exports. Mozambique followed in 2017. The outcome: entire industries of carpentry, furniture making, and wood processing grew at home. Jobs multiplied, tax revenues increased, and for the first time, wood profits stayed in Africa. These policies transformed what once looked like a simple trade rule into a declaration of independence. Our forests will no longer enrich only foreign nations, they will enrich us. Perhaps the most dramatic case is Niger, sitting on some of the world's richest uranium deposits. For decades, France powered its grid, 70% nuclear on uranium bought dirt cheap from Niger. Yet Niger itself remained one of the poorest countries in the world. After a major political shift, Niger imposed strict export controls on uranium, sending shockwaves through Europe. Suddenly, the illusion of French energy independence collapsed. Paris discovered that its power lines ran straight through African soil. Niger's decision exposed not only dependency, but also hypocrisy. If Europe truly believed in fair partnership, why had Niger been left impoverished while fueling a continent? The pattern doesn't stop there. Guinea banned exports of staple crops like rice and maize to protect its own food supply, declaring that its citizens would no longer go hungry while ships carried their harvests abroad. Namibia, home to critical lithium reserves, halted raw exports in order to force tech giants to build processing plants on African soil. Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa producer, imposed restrictions to keep beans at home and grow its own chocolate industry. The Democratic Republic of Congo, rich in copper and cobalt vital for smartphones and electric cars, did the same, requiring local processing before export. And finally, Zimbabwe banned raw chrome exports, investing in smelters, so its chrome would no longer be sold cheap to foreign buyers. 10 nations, 10 bold decisions, each unique but all connected by a single thread: sovereignty. For the first time, African governments are telling the world that their resources are not for cheap extraction, but for national development. They are refusing to play the role of passive suppliers and are stepping into the role of global players. This wave of policies is not small or symbolic. It is structural. It is transforming economies, rewriting trade patterns, and forcing Western corporations to confront a new reality. If you want Africa's gold, uranium, cocoa, or lithium, you must now engage with Africa on African terms. The continent is no longer giving away its wealth. It is using it to fuel its own rise. Every great story of change has its breaking point, the moment when the stakes rise so high that no one can look away. In Africa's new fight for resource sovereignty, that breaking point came with Niger's uranium. For decades, France built its energy security on a hidden truth: nearly 70% of its electricity grid runs on nuclear power, and much of that power depends on uranium mined from Niger. It was a quiet dependency rarely acknowledged in Paris. Uranium left Niger dirt-cheap, profits landed in French corporations, and Niger itself stayed one of the world's poorest nations. The imbalance was so stark it almost defied logic. How could a country that powered France's lights remain in the dark itself? Then came the shockwave. Niger announced restrictions on uranium exports, targeting France directly. Overnight, the illusion of French independence collapsed. French politicians scrambled, energy markets trembled. Analysts warned of higher electricity bills, shrinking supply, and a potential crisis of confidence in France's nuclear industry. And for the first time, Europe was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality: without Niger, their independence was nothing but a myth. That moment was not just an economic tremor, it was a political earthquake. It symbolized Africa's new willingness to strike at the very core of Western comfort. No more silence, no more giveaways. If you want Africa's resources, you must pay fairly, you must invest locally, and you must respect sovereignty. The reactions rippled worldwide. Western media painted the decisions as risky, warning of instability in Africa. Politicians in Brussels and Washington used phrases like threat to global supply chains. But on African soil, the reaction was entirely different. Citizens from Burkina Faso to Uganda saw these moves as historic victories, the long-awaited second independence. For the first time in modern history, African governments weren't begging for aid, they were dictating terms. Streets buzzed with pride. Local newspapers hailed a new dawn. Social media across the continent lit up with one refrain: Africa is rising. And the private sector, Western corporations that once counted on cheap cocoa, timber, and cobalt, are suddenly being forced to recalculate. Chocolate giants now face higher costs for Ivorian beans. Electric vehicle companies dependent on cobalt and lithium are scrambling to secure deals, some even rushing to negotiate joint ventures with African governments. Furniture producers in Europe, who once relied on raw African timber, now must buy value-added products at higher prices or lose access entirely. Even more striking, non-Western powers are responding with open arms. China, Russia, India, and BRICS partners see opportunity where the West sees threat. They are offering investments in local processing plants, infrastructure, and technology transfers. Unlike the old colonial pattern of extraction, these new partnerships, at least on paper, promise Africa more control and leverage. The contrast is hard to miss. While Western officials lecture about risks, other nations are lining up to shake hands and sign contracts. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came not from governments or corporations, but from ordinary people. In markets across Ghana, farmers said they finally felt that their sweat was no longer being sold cheap abroad. In Kampala, young workers in new coffee roasting factories saw hope of real careers, not just subsistence farming. In Gabon and Mozambique, carpenters and furniture makers spoke of dignity, turning raw wood into finished products that proudly carried the label "Made in Africa." This is why Niger's uranium restrictions became the climax of the story. It was the clearest demonstration that Africa holds leverage over the very systems the West considers untouchable. Nuclear power in Europe, electric cars in America, smartphones in Asia, all of it runs on African soil. For decades, that fact was hidden beneath contracts, corporations, and colonial hangovers. Today, it is out in the open. The script has flipped, and the reactions prove it. The West is nervous, scrambling, even panicked. Africa is proud, emboldened, determined. This is the turning point. Not just policies, not just bans, but a profound shift in global psychology. Africa is no longer begging to participate in the world economy. The world economy is begging to participate in Africa. When a continent decides to rewrite the rules of global trade, the consequences are not abstract. They are felt in the lives of ordinary people, in the pulse of politics, and in the very identity of nations. Africa's stand against raw export dependency is no exception. The ripple effects are already transforming both civil society and political landscapes across the continent. On the civil side, the first and most visible effect is jobs. In Uganda, the ban on raw coffee exports has led to the rise of roasting and packaging plants. Young men and women who once worked as day laborers in fields now operate machines, manage logistics, or even handle marketing for coffee brands proudly stamped "produced in Uganda." For the first time, a farmer's son can dream of a career beyond subsistence farming because the value chain has shifted home. The same is true in Gabon and Mozambique, where timber policies sparked local carpentry and furniture industries. Entire neighborhoods that once echoed only with the sound of axes now hum with the buzz of sawmills and workshops. The pride of crafting a table, a door, or a chair that sells on the international market, finished, not raw, has restored a sense of dignity long denied to African workers. In Ghana, mandatory refining of gold has created new opportunities in metallurgy and finance. Ordinary citizens see something remarkable. Their central bank is holding gold reserves for the future, not just scraps of foreign currency vulnerable to outside shocks. This is more than economics. It's a message that Ghana is protecting its people from the turbulence of global markets. But with pride comes tension. Western corporations accustomed to cheap access are pushing back, sometimes quietly through lobbying, sometimes loudly through media campaigns. Local leaders must navigate the pressure. Can they withstand corporate and diplomatic retaliation while keeping their promises to citizens? This is where politics enters the story. Across Africa, these policies are fueling a new wave of political legitimacy. Leaders who stand firm, who say, "Our resources are for our people first," are gaining immense popularity. Citizens see them not as politicians playing games, but as guardians of national dignity. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré embodies this image, a leader who refuses to bow to outside pressure and insists that sovereignty is not negotiable. Even beyond Burkina Faso, his example is being watched closely. Ordinary Africans are asking, why can't our leaders do the same? This rising expectation reshapes domestic politics. Opposition parties can no longer win votes by promising foreign partnerships alone. They must prove how those deals will benefit local communities. Youth movements, long disillusioned by corruption, now rally around the idea of resource sovereignty as a concrete pathway to justice. Yet challenges remain. Some governments lack the infrastructure to process resources fully. In countries like Guinea, the decision to ban crop exports has stabilized domestic food supplies, but sparked fears of black markets and smuggling. In the DRC, enforcing new rules on cobalt requires fighting corruption and building factories that don't yet exist. These gaps create political risks. If leaders cannot deliver on the promise of prosperity, frustration may grow. Still, the overall shift is unmistakable. Civil society feels a newfound empowerment. Politics feels more rooted in sovereignty and accountability. And across the continent, a deeper truth is sinking in. Independence was never just about waving a flag. It is about feeding your people, building your industries, and making decisions that serve the nation before serving outsiders. This is the civil and political heartbeat of Africa's export revolution. It is messy, it is challenging, but it is also historic. For the first time in centuries, ordinary Africans feel that the rules are being written with them in mind, not against them. From Washington to Brussels, the tremors of Africa's new export rules are impossible to ignore. For decades, Western nations operated under a quiet assumption Africa would always supply raw materials cheaply and reliably. Now that assumption has been shattered. The global order is shifting and the reactions tell us everything about where the fault lines lie. In the United States, policymakers and corporate leaders are sounding alarms. Electric vehicle makers like Tesla and Ford depend heavily on cobalt from the DRC and lithium from Namibia. Restrictions on those resources mean higher costs, disrupted timelines, and an urgent scramble to diversify supply chains. American tech giants from smartphone manufacturers to solar panel producers are being forced to consider what they long resisted: building factories and investing in Africa itself. Washington frames the issue as supply chain security, but beneath the jargon lies a simple truth: America is not in control anymore. Europe, meanwhile, is facing its own reckoning. France's dependence on Niger's uranium exposed not just an economic risk, but a geopolitical vulnerability. Across the European Union, officials now whisper about strategic autonomy, yet those conversations are laced with panic. Energy bills are rising. Industries tied to African cocoa timber and chrome are recalculating profits. European chocolate makers long used to cheap beans from Ivory Coast must now pay more or invest directly in African processing plants. For Europe, the age of entitlement is over. But beyond the West, the picture looks very different. China, Russia, India, and the BRICS bloc are seizing the moment. These nations present themselves as willing partners, ready to build refineries, smelters, and factories on African soil. Whether their promises prove genuine or not, the symbolism matters. Africa now has choices. No longer does the continent have to rely on Western capitals for development. The world's fastest-growing economies are competing for Africa's trust, offering investments where the West offers warnings. For many Americans watching this from afar, the question is sobering. The U.S. spent decades projecting influence in Africa through aid programs, military bases, and trade deals that often tilted toward American interests. But today, a younger generation of African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are rejecting that model. They speak openly about sovereignty, dignity, and ending dependency. For older Americans who lived through the Cold War, the echoes are striking. Just as nations once broke free from colonial empires, Africa now demands freedom from economic dependency. Globally, markets are reacting with volatility. Commodity prices are rising, corporations are adjusting strategies, and investors are weighing risks. Yet beneath the numbers is a larger transformation. Africa is no longer being spoken of as the world's periphery. It is central, indispensable, and powerful. The deeper message to the world is this: resource sovereignty is not just an African story, it is a global one. If America and Europe adapt, they may find a new kind of partnership based on equality rather than extraction. If they resist, they risk losing influence to those more willing to play by Africa's new terms. For the first time in modern history, Africa holds the cards. The US, Europe, and the rest of the world must decide: engage respectfully or be left behind. The story of Africa's raw material revolution is not a footnote. It is the opening chapter of a new world order. 10 African nations have stood up and said no more. No more selling gold, uranium, coffee, cocoa, timber, lithium, or chrome for pennies while others reap billions. No more empty promises of development while citizens remain poor. This is Africa's second independence, not won on battlefields, but in boardrooms, parliaments, and policy decrees. But let us be clear, this revolution is fragile. History teaches us that whenever Africa dares to assert control over its own resources, powerful interests push back. We have seen sabotage, sanctions, even wars justified in the name of stability or security. Do you think the West will quietly accept higher costs and lost leverage, or will it attempt to destabilize the very leaders who are driving this movement? That question looms over every decision being made in capitals from Accra to Ouagadougou. And yet there is no turning back. The people of Africa have tasted what sovereignty feels like: jobs created at home, industries built locally, pride restored in the dignity of labor. They will not easily surrender that vision. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso symbolize this shift, a younger generation unafraid to challenge systems that once seemed untouchable. His stance and those of his allies are forcing the world to confront a truth long denied: Africa is not the world's supplier. It is the world's partner, and in some cases, its lifeline. For older Americans watching this, perhaps you remember when the United States once stood for self-reliance, industry, and independence. That is the language Africa is now speaking. The question is whether Washington and Europe will learn to listen or cling to outdated habits of extraction and dominance. So I ask you directly, can we continue to trust leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré to carry this fight forward, or will another generation need to rise to finish the job? Do you believe the West will adapt, or will it resist until the very end? Your thoughts matter. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to witness and support this historic awakening. Comment below if you believe Africa's sovereignty is not just Africa's fight, but the world's future. And subscribe if you believe that truth, raw, unpolished, and unapologetic matters more than the headlines. Because this is bigger than gold, coffee, or uranium. This is about dignity. This is about independence. And this is about the dawn of a new era where Africa rises not as a silent supplier, but as a sovereign force shaping the destiny of the world.